In this episode, we're going to do a spaced retrieval review that pulls together the privacy engineering decisions you make across infrastructure, endpoints, connectivity, development practices, and the special controls that show up in modern tracking and AI systems. The reason this kind of review matters is that beginners often learn each topic as if it lives on its own island, but privacy failures usually happen in the gaps between islands, where one team's assumptions collide with another team's defaults. Domain 4 is about engineering privacy into technology choices and operational controls, which means you are learning a way of thinking that must stay consistent even as the stack changes and as new tools appear. You should be able to mentally walk from cloud platforms to devices to networks to code to analytics and see where privacy intent can quietly erode. This review is designed to strengthen recall by repeatedly connecting concepts, not by listing them, so you can rebuild the logic under exam pressure. If you can explain how decisions across the stack reinforce each other, you are doing privacy engineering rather than just memorizing privacy vocabulary. Start by recalling the infrastructure and platform choices, because they set the environment where all other controls must operate. Infrastructure decisions determine where data can live, how quickly systems change, and who controls which layers of the stack, especially when legacy systems coexist with cloud services. The key retrieval prompt is to ask how a platform choice affects data location, access pathways, and change velocity, because those three factors shape privacy risk regardless of the vendor or technology. In a legacy environment, risk often comes from broad internal trust, manual processes, and long-lived systems that become unofficial archives. In cloud environments, risk often comes from fast provisioning, sprawl, and misconfiguration that can expose data quickly and at scale. You should remember that neither is automatically safe, because safety comes from consistent identity control, segmentation, monitoring, and lifecycle governance applied in the environment you actually have. Shared responsibility is also essential here, because cloud providers reduce certain operational burdens but do not remove your accountability for how data is handled. When you can connect platform choices to practical enforcement of access control and retention, you are recalling the main lesson of Domain 4A1. That lesson is that architecture is a privacy control because it determines how governable the environment will be. From there, recall devices and endpoints, because endpoints are where privacy risk meets human behavior and physical reality. A key retrieval prompt is to ask what personal information can accumulate on a device through residue, such as cache documents, saved sessions, downloads, and local logs, because residue is one of the most common sources of accidental exposure. Endpoint security protects privacy by limiting local storage, enforcing encryption, controlling sessions, and making sure that loss or compromise does not turn into organization-wide exposure. Device management like MDM helps enforce consistent baseline controls so privacy protection does not depend on each individual's discipline under pressure. Detection like EDR can reduce harm by shortening attacker dwell time. But you must remember that monitoring data itself can become a privacy exposure if it captures too much or is accessed too broadly. The deeper recall point is that endpoints are not just entry points for attackers. They are also distribution points for uncontrolled copies, which defeat retention and deletion goals. When you connect endpoints back to lifecycle thinking, you see that controlling residue and export behavior is part of data minimization. Endpoints are where privacy intent is most likely to be tested in ordinary work, which is why endpoint controls matter so much. Connectivity is the next retrieval anchor because it determines what routes data is allowed to take across networks and services. Your mental checkpoint here should be to ask whether the environment is flat and broadly reachable or segmented and purposefully connected, because segmentation contains privacy risk by limiting reachability and limiting accidental data movement. Remote access pathways and trust assumptions also matter, because treating remote users as fully internal can create broad reachability and large blast radius if an endpoint is compromised. Identity-based access thinking, often captured in ZTA, supports privacy because it makes each connection conditional and narrow rather than trusting location. Encryption in transit matters because it prevents interception and tampering, but you should recall that encryption is only strong when identity validation and configuration are correct. Connectivity monitoring helps detect misuse and unusual patterns, but it must be designed to avoid creating a new dataset of sensitive content through excessive logging. Another important retrieval point is third-party connectivity, because every integration can become a disclosure channel that must be justified, minimized, and monitored. When you see connectivity as a privacy boundary, you can explain why the safest data flow is the one that never exists and why necessary flows should be narrow and controlled. The secure development life cycle connects engineering practice to privacy outcomes, and your retrieval prompt here should be to remember that privacy does not have to slow delivery when it is implemented as guardrails rather than last-minute gates. Requirements and design stages are where privacy intent is easiest to preserve because decisions about data collection, purpose, and architecture are still malleable. Implementation becomes smoother when teams reuse approved patterns for handling identifiers, logging, retention triggers, and access checks, rather than inventing custom solutions that require repeated review. Testing for privacy often looks like testing for correct authorization, correct minimization and outputs, correct deletion behavior, and correct logging behavior, which can be automated and run continuously. The key recall point is that late privacy fixes are what slow delivery, because data has already spread into warehouses, logs, and integrations. When privacy is embedded early, teams avoid expensive rework and reduce the chance of shipping features that require emergency rollbacks. You should also remember that dependencies and third-party components can create hidden data flows, which means privacy must be part of component selection and configuration decisions. When you can explain privacy as engineering hygiene that prevents surprises, you are recalling the core of Domain 4A4. API and cloud-native service design is the next retrieval anchor because modern systems fail quietly through interfaces. Silent privacy failure modes often begin with overexposure, where interfaces return more data than needed, and purpose drift, where shared services become convenient taps for raw profiles. A key recall prompt is to ask what data a service can request, what it can return, and what it can log, because these decisions determine whether personal information spreads through internal calls, events, caches, and telemetry. Fine-grained authorization through IAM is essential, especially for non-human identities that can extract data at scale. Event-based systems can replicate data widely, which means payload minimization and subscriber control are critical to prevent data becoming a broadcast stream. Caching can store sensitive content and serve it incorrectly if scoped poorly, and observability can capture sensitive payloads repeatedly across services if logging is not disciplined. Contract changes can also silently expand exposure, because adding a sensitive field to a widely used response can propagate that field into many downstream systems immediately. When you recall that cloud-native systems are fast and distributed, you remember why privacy must be engineered into contracts and defaults. This is where you see privacy intent preserved or lost one interface at a time. Asset management and IAM are the next pair to retrieve because they make governance actionable. Without a clear inventory and clear ownership, least privilege cannot be maintained, retention cannot be applied consistently, and incident response becomes chaotic. IAM enforces privacy daily by restricting who can access personal information and what they can do with it, and least privilege is the principle that shrinks exposure and blast radius. Separation of duties matters because high-risk sequences like granting access and exporting data should not be possible without oversight. Service identities and automation need special care because they can access data continuously and at scale, which turns overbroad permissions into silent extraction pathways. Access reviews prevent permission drift, which is one of the most common reasons least privilege fails over time. When you can connect asset inventory and ownership to practical access approvals and recertification, you are recalling how governance becomes operational. The main point is that privacy programs cannot rely on informal knowledge. They need structure that survives team changes and system changes. Asset management and IAM provide that structure. Patching, hardening, transport protocols, and cryptography form the next retrieval cluster because they are foundational controls that keep privacy promises from being broken by preventable technical weaknesses. Patching closes known vulnerabilities that attackers exploit to reach personal information, and hardening reduces unnecessary exposure by tightening configurations and turning off risky defaults. At scale, Discipline requires inventory, standard baselines, verification, and controlled exception handling, because unknown and unpatched systems are common sources of exposure. Transport protocol choices affect whether data and credentials are protected in transit, and weak legacy pathways often become the weakest link that undermines stronger controls elsewhere. Encryption and hashing are powerful tools when used correctly, but you should recall their honest limits. Encryption protects confidentiality when key management is strong, and hashing is not anonymity, especially for predictable values that can be guessed and matched. Cryptographic reality includes key control, correct configuration, and lifecycle discipline, because keeping encrypted data forever can still be risky if keys remain accessible and systems change. The retrieval point is that these controls reduce the likelihood of unauthorized access and interception, which is essential for privacy, but they do not replace minimization and purpose limitations. They are part of a layered approach that supports privacy intent under real-world attack pressure. Monitoring and logging needs to be retrieved carefully because it is both a protective control and a potential new exposure source. Monitoring supports privacy by detecting misuse, verifying that access control is functioning, and enabling incident response to contain harm quickly. The risk is that logs can become a rich secondary dataset that includes identifiers, behavior patterns, and sometimes content, and centralizing that data can increase blast radius. A key recall prompt is to ask what purpose a log entry serves and whether sensitive fields are truly necessary, because purpose-driven logging prevents overcollection. Access controls, retention limits, and careful alert payload design prevent monitoring from spreading sensitive data into ticket systems and chat threads. Centralized security tooling like SIEM can improve detection, but it must be governed with strict access limits and minimization so correlation does not become surveillance. Tracing and metrics in cloud-native observability can create linkability if they use stable user identifiers, so privacy-aware design prefers ephemeral identifiers and minimal payload capture. The lesson is that monitoring is essential, but it must be engineered with the same privacy discipline as primary data systems. When monitoring is governed, it strengthens privacy. When it is unmanaged, it becomes the problem. Consent tagging and tracking governance are the next retrieval cluster because they represent how user choice and expectations become enforceable behavior in systems. Consent tagging must travel with data so downstream systems can honor the same limits even when data moves into analytics, services, and vendors. The key recall prompt is to ask where consent is checked, where consent metadata can be lost, and how revocation is handled when data has already spread. Tracking technologies are a special risk zone because they can collect behavioral data silently through cookies, pixels, software development kits, and fingerprinting techniques. Cookie management must be an enforcement system, not just a banner, meaning non-essential trackers must not run before appropriate permission exists when required. Third-party tracking is especially risky because it creates disclosure channels where data can be used beyond the user's expectations, which is why inventory, purpose categorization, and change control matter. Retention and identifier lifetimes also matter, because long-lived identifiers enable long-term profiling and undermine minimization goals. When you can explain tracking governance as purpose-based rules that are technically enforced and continuously monitored, you are recalling domain 4C2 at the level the exam expects. Consent and tracking are about durable intent, not about decorative compliance. Anonymization, pseudonymization, and broader PET choices are the next recall anchor because they are often used to enable analytics and sharing while reducing exposure. You should remember that anonymization is a claim that must be verified, because quasi-identifiers and linkability can allow re-identification even when names are removed. Pseudonymization reduces exposure by replacing identifiers and protecting the link, but it still allows tracking if tokens are stable and shared broadly, and it still requires strong governance around the mapping. Privacy-enhancing technologies must be matched to threats, data, and architecture, because DP is different from SMPC, HE, and TEE, and each has trade-offs and different protection goals. Verification is the connecting theme. You must test re-identification risk, test output leakage risk, and ensure operational controls support the technique rather than undermining it through exports and overretention. Beginners should also recall that transformed data can still create group harms and inference harms, so governance must address use limitations, not only identifiability. When you match a PET to a specific threat and validate it, you reduce risk without overclaiming. This is the difference between privacy engineering and privacy marketing. Finally, recall the AI and machine learning considerations because they show how modern systems can create privacy risk through inference, drift, and overcollection, even when no database breach occurs. Before deployment, privacy work includes purpose definition, feature minimization, consent alignment, output design, and planning for monitoring and lifecycle events like retraining and decommissioning. After deployment, detection focuses on inference risks, misuse of outputs, drift that changes who is affected, and overcollection pressures that expand data scope under performance demands. The key retrieval prompt is to treat model outputs as data assets that can reveal sensitive information and to monitor who consumes them and for what purpose. Drift detection matters because drift can trigger privacy-harming responses like collecting more data and retaining more history, so disciplined responses are needed. Overcollection must be detected through feature audits, pipeline change tracking, and baselines that define what the model is allowed to use. When you can explain how AI systems leak information through behavior and outputs, you are recalling a modern privacy reality that the domain emphasizes. AI privacy is about preventing silent failure modes at scale. As we conclude, the main goal of this spaced retrieval review is for you to be able to rebuild the logic of privacy engineering across the full technology stack without relying on a memorized checklist. Infrastructure and connectivity choices shape data location and reachability. Endpoints shape residue and human exposure, and the SDLC shapes whether privacy is built in early or bolted on late. API and cloud-native design determines whether data spreads silently through interfaces, events, caches, and logs, while asset management and IAM keep ownership and least privilege enforceable over time. Patching, hardening, transport protocols, and cryptography reduce preventable exposure through known weaknesses and insecure pathways, and monitoring supports accountability when it is purpose-driven and minimized. Consent tagging and tracking governance keep user choice durable across systems, while anonymization, pseudonymization, and PET help reduce exposure when matched to the right threats and verified honestly. AI systems add unique pitfalls through inference, drift, and overcollection, requiring both pre-production guardrails and post-deployment detection discipline. When you can connect these decisions into one coherent story about keeping data purposeful, contained, minimized, and governable across change, you are demonstrating the privacy engineering mindset the certification is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.